Hi, everyone. Welcome to another edition of the Seforim Chatter podcast. On this episode of the podcast, I'm going to be joined once again by Professor Edward Fram, who is Associate Professor of Jewish History and Sali Yellen Chair in Lithuanian and Eastern European Jewish Culture at Ben Gurion University of the Negev. And in this episode, we'll be discussing his brand new book, which is called The Codification of Jewish Law on the Cusp of Modernity, published by Cambridge University Press, which discusses halacha, mainly focused on Rav Yosef Karo and the Shulchan Aruch, and Rav Yosef and other seforim, the Rema, Isserles, and the Maharshal of Shlomo Luria. So thank you, Professor Fram, for joining me once again.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so let's start off. Why did you decide to work on this book, to publish a book on the development of halacha, let's call it? And really, I should leave it to you to talk about, is that what the book is about? I know I read the title, what exactly it's about and why you decided to write this book.
So I believe that certainly in the 16th century, which I think is a pivotal century in terms of the history of halacha, halacha still is for Jewish communities around the world the central and motivating factor in their lives. That doesn't mean that everyone is an expert in halacha. It doesn't mean that everyone knows all the various books, but halacha is still a guiding force. And halacha undergoes a major change in the way it's used in the 16th century with the publication of Shulchan Aruch. But Shulchan Aruch isn't just published and accepted by everyone. There are old traditions that exist, and there are people who look at Shulchan Aruch and they say, well, we're not sure whether this is really the right sort of book. So that point in time, I think, is crucial because ultimately Shulchan Aruch will win the day. So I thought then, and I still think now, it's worth going back and taking a look at that process.
Okay, so why these three individuals? That kind of answers Rav Yosef Karo. So why we'll get to their bio in a second, but why the Rema and the Maharshal as well?
So the Rema and the Maharshal, while the Rema is the person who comments on Shulchan Aruch, it's the Maharshal, Rav Shlomo Luria, who represents these older traditions of learning, and that's part of the conflict that's taking place here. It's not just someone who comes up with a new idea influenced by the world of print, but there's also an older tradition. And how does that older tradition accept this or not accept it? How does it respond to it? So that's why the Maharshal fits in.
Okay, so let's start out now, but before we get into the actual book, is all three of these figures. Talk a little bit about them, when they lived, where they're from, who they learned under, their biography, I guess.
Okay, so Rav Yosef Karo was born in Toledo before the expulsion from Spain. So he is really one of those people who suffered through the expulsion from Spain. He was still a young person, but still that was a traumatic experience, I'm sure, for him and his family. And then he begins a period of wandering until finally he'll come to the land of Israel, come to Sfat in the 1530s, and he'll settle in Sfat, and that's where he'll do his major writing. But he starts writing his Beit Yosef before he comes to Israel. So he's a product of the expulsion. He studies with his uncle, and he brings with him traditions from Spain. Rav Shlomo Luria was born in Poznan, I think, and he comes from a rabbinic family that seems to have connection to worms, so he has an Ashkenaz connection. And unfortunately for him, he's going to get booted around as a rabbi from a number of different communities. But ultimately, he'll end up in Lublin, where he'll die. And finally, Rav Moshe Isserles is a man who's born into a wealthy family. And he is born in Krakow to a wealthy businessman. And his father has great influence in moving him forward in his position. But he grows into the position. And he is the Rav of Krakow from approximately 1550 or so until the time of his death in 1572.
So we're solidly in the 16th century, the 1500s, for this book. So we'll pick up with Rav Yosef Karo, the oldest one, and the one that you start with, the most famous one. And so there's a couple things you mentioned in the book. You obviously talk about the reception of his famous Beis Yosef, which is his commentary on Torah. There's his Shulchan Aruch, as everybody knows. He also has Kesef Mishnah, which you don't get that on the commentary on Rambam, which you don't get that into in this book. And then there's also, so there's not only the printing, the printing history, the reception of that, and then there's also his style and his of psak and halach and how he, paskin. So the book starts off the former, not the latter, but maybe you want to start off with the Beis Yosef first in general, just generally speaking, which is kind of the latter, which is how he, I guess, comes to be a psak and his novel ideas of psak and halacha.
So I think that the Beit Yosef is someone who was very familiar with the criticism that was leveled at the Rambam. The Rambam, Mishnah Torah, was partially criticized for not listing its sources. So when Rav Yosef Karo wanted to write a book of halacha, he knew that he had to somehow justify what his decisions were going to be. And that's what the Beit Yosef is about. It takes him almost about 30 years, I can't say to the day, but about 30 years to complete the Beit Yosef. It's an absolutely monumental work that shows great erudition. And in it, he basically works off Rav Yaakov ben Asher's tour, and he gives all the sources that he considers in coming to his final psak. Now, in the Beit Yosef, if you could find the final psak, it would just take you a long time because it's a very large book. Right, so that's the advantage of Shulchan Aruch. But if you ever want to know what the source of the decision in Shulchan Aruch is, you go back to the Beit Yosef. So Shulchan Aruch, that way, becomes a well-founded book. You can always find the sources. And the Beit Yosef is printed in totality before Shulchan Aruch appears. So that's why the Beit Yosef is so important. That's the place where we'll find the method.
Now, what is that method that he invented?
So in most cases, remember there are thousands and thousands of rulings within the Beit Yosef and Shulchan Aruch. In most cases, it's not so difficult because there's more or less some form of agreement on how the halacha should be. The problem is, what do you do when there's disputes? And that's where Rav Yosef Karo develops his rather original idea, in the sense that it's original to his time. It's not. We don't think it's original to him, but he is the most famous user of the idea that in order to save time, instead of coming along and examining the pros and cons of every view, he's going to take a very, very pragmatic position, and he is going to say that if I have two of the three major poskim, we'll discuss who they are in a moment, agree to one view, then that's the view I'm going to follow. Again, I have to emphasize, he doesn't do that in every single section of his work. In most sections, there's some form of, if not unanimity, but there's some sort of consensus. But in cases where he can't come to that, that's what he uses. Now, he picks three people. He picks Rav Yitzchak Alfasi, the Rif, he picks the Rambam, and he picks Rav Asher ben Yechiel. Now, right there's a problem, because Yitzchak Alfasi had a student named Rav Yosef ibn Migash. And Rav Yosef ibn Migash had a student named Maimon, and Maimon had a son named Moshe, meaning there's a direct line between the Rif and the Rambam, and very often the Rambam is simply going to follow his teacher. This line is so clear that sometimes people call the Rambam a student of the Rif, even though he never studied with the Rif. The Rif died before the Rambam was born. But that line is a very clear line. And that privileges the Rif Rambam axis against Rav Asher ben Yechiel, who represents not only Ashkenaz, but different ways of thinking. And that means that the Sephardic way is going to be privileged against the Ashkenazic way based simply on a majority.
Now, so like I said, when he takes these three, he goes with the majority of these. First of all, you mentioned that he wasn't the only one to come up with such a thing. What do you mean? Who else do you know that?
We know of other people in the time who seem to also use this 2 out of 3 rule. Rav Yosef Karo uses it more extensively than anyone we know, but I think you can find this in the Radbaz, and I think you can find this in other places, perhaps even predating Yosef Karo. I can't say that I know of specific examples from the 15th century where people use this, but it doesn't seem that this idea is of using a majority amongst a chosen group was absolutely unique, but nobody uses that as extensively and essentially as, I wanted to say almost problematically, but we'll stick with extensively as Yosef Karo does.
And so that's something that you talk about in the book, where it's interesting because we know Basaroi, Basaruba, you take the majority, but here he invented kind of this majority where he took Yosef Karo took these three and says, oh, I'm going to go with two of the three. So there are examples, I don't know if you want to mention them, there are examples where you say even sometimes where he could be makel because there's two out of three, and that will what it will seem like to you. But then if you look at the sources, there could be 10 poskim the other way, and so it's not really the majority. But again, this is something that he came up with.
Right. What's really unique about, and this is original, Rav Yosef Karo's choice of the three is rather, that's original. The idea that maybe I have three outstanding poskim, that maybe other people have used, but this choice of the Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh as being his guiding lights, that really is something that we don't see with other people. Now, it should be said that sometimes Rav Yosef Karo can't find an opinion that he's looking for in the Rif or the Rambam or the Rosh, and therefore he might find three other people he's going to use. The Rashba is somebody he also relies on. There are other people from time to time he uses, but this is in his own introduction, these are the three people he mentions, and these are the three people that he mentions more often than not. But as you said, in some cases, it could be that many other people are mekel, but because two out of these three are machmir, he is going to take the machmir opinion.
I believe there's something you mentioned in the book also. So this is just, he would take three and the two out of the three would win the day, no matter what the reasoning would be. This is just the way it worked.
Well, that's precisely the point, because when you say no matter what the reasoning is, he's not following reasoning. He is following a number game. And that's the majority. So that's a troubling aspect, because if you talk about, well, look, we have courts, and courts rule based on majority. You have a tribunal, and a tribunal has three people, and two of the judges rule one way, and one judge rules the other way. We follow the two. But the difference, this is already pointed out by the Rashba, and the Mechaber knew this himself because he cites it. In a court, the three people are there to discuss the matter. And therefore, we assume that if the two were not able to convince the one, then we allow the one to keep his opinion, and it's a minority opinion. But they discussed it. The pros and cons were all brought. The Rif, the Rambam, and the Rosh all lived in different times. They couldn't discuss any of this. So that's a much different approach to majority rule.
Right, and clearly we'll get to the Maharshal and Rema later, but does Rav Yosef Karo ever use other reasonings,
Yes, certainly. Rav Yosef Karo really, really is a very, very well-educated person, and sometimes he has to use different reasoning, and he will use it in different cases. We have some cases that I mentioned here, that he uses his own reasoning to come to his conclusions. And in those cases, he's not someone who's against legal reasoning, but legal reasoning takes much more time. He's trying to be very practical to get all through the tour and write this entire Beit Yosef. It takes him 30 years using this shortcut. But saved time, but of course he opened himself up to criticism.
Right, this is like you're saying. Obviously, there is many other mahalchim, but this is the one where he uses a shortcut. You said open up to criticism, where there are other criticism of other, gedolim at the time that had this criticism of him.
So at the time, I can't say that I know other people who came out against him, but over time, there's certainly other people. Perhaps most famously, the Pri Chadash in the 17th century was going to attack Rav Yosef Karo quite clearly, and there will be others who won't. But if you think about everything that grew up in the margins of Shulchan Aruch, in many ways, Taz, Shach, these people are all essentially not accepting these rules. They're going back, and they're going back to rationales and other such issues. So the criticisms that go on as we move into the 17th century, when you have a number of books written, more Chaim, Yerodea, Oshen Mishpat, Ibn Ezra, these things are all essentially reactions to this. But the text is already one, so the commentaries around the text They're looking for rationales.
Any examples offhand that you have of this, Rav Yosef Karo? Now, I should mention that the book, there's 90 pages, is your chapter in Rav Yosef Karo almost. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe with the introduction, maybe it's a little less, but it's pretty extensive. And the book also has footnotes, not endnotes. So these are, it's a big chapter on him.
Yeah, Rav Yosef Karo clearly is, there'll be much more written on him. This is not the last word. Not only on Yosef Karo, not only on Rema and Maharshal, or on the whole topic. There'll be many people who come, I hope, and examine these things and add more. But I think that Rav Yosef Karo certainly is a very creative person, and he just took a shortcut in one aspect of his work.
Now, something else you mentioned, like in the beginning of the chapter, is the reception of Beis Yosef and Shulchan Aruch, of the printing of it and the seforim.
Right. So the book, Beit Yosef, of course, was a major printing endeavor. That's an expensive book to print. When you remember that all this had to be typeset by hand, this is a major endeavor. Shulchan Aruch is a much cheaper, and it's published 3 times in short order. It really becomes a bestseller. And that's before the Rema even gets to it. Right? So it really sells very, very well. And people love it. Why wouldn't they love it? It's a summary of the halacha. You become an expert in halacha in no time. You just look in Shulchan Aruch and you have the answer. And people do buy it. The Beit Yosef is also very much accepted, and it doesn't take very long until it becomes an essential part of the tour. But that's a much bigger project and a much more expensive book.
Okay, so then you move on to the Maharshal, or Shlomo Luria, and there's really 2 parts here we can get into when you discuss them in the book. There's the printing history of Yam Shlomo, which, just say as a spoiler alert, it takes a long time. It's not published till much later, much after his life, so he kind of falls through the cracks a little bit here with this. But let's first talk about the Maharshal. Again, I'm flipping around the order a little bit. Talk about the Maharshal. Get the listeners, to talk about when you're reading the book, it makes sense. But here, just talk about the Maharshal, and then we'll get to the printing history. So about the Maharshal, about his style of psak, and especially how that differs from we just heard about Rav Yosef Karo.
So the Maharshal is someone who really harkens back to the Ashkenazic tradition. He believes that if you want to really know how to come to a final psak, you have to go back to the Gemara and work your way through the poskim and figure out what you think is the right way to understand the sugya. Now, the Maharshal is very much aware that he is not the last word in halacha, and he expects that as generations go on, people will have different opinions. But he thinks it's incumbent upon everyone to go and make a clear reading of all these sources and come to independent conclusions. He writes down in his Yam Shel Shlomo what he thinks is the right conclusion. He tries to deal with the various sources, weigh the pros and cons of the opinions, and come to conclusions. And that's what he does. But that makes for a much, much longer book and a much more difficult book to read, where someone can pick up Shulchan Aruch and find the conclusion in a moment. If they're capable of reading Rabbinic Hebrew, you can know the answer while standing on one foot. In the Maharshal, it requires much, much more work. You have to go back to the Gemara, you have to understand what it is he's talking about, the sources he's citing, and also why he thinks this one is right and why he thinks this one is wrong. And clearly, even after the Maharshal's death, some of his students who had access to his work even while it was in manuscript, they don't always agree with him. But that's his view. His view is you have to go back and work it through. And that's a fundamentally different view than that of Rav Yosef Karo.
So can you elaborate a little bit more on how has that come out exactly different in his work when he says, going back to the source and working through it as opposed to Rav Yosef Karo?
So if you have a sugya in the Gemara, and then you have various the Rishonim who comment on it, then you have to consider which of the comments of the Rishonim is really most correct. Which one solves most sugyas? Which one, if you take it across all of the Gemara, which one is going to solve your problems? How does it fit in with the views of others? So the Maharshal is very sensitive to all those issues. He is trying to work out to see, okay, this is the best reading. If that's the best reading, he's cognizant of custom, he's cognizant of other factors as well. But if that's the best reading, all other things being equal, he's going to go with that's the best reading. The idea of a majority rule that I took 3 poskim and I decided amongst these three poskim who it is that I'm going to follow two of the three. That's an anathema to Luria. Luria is a man who's out there seeking what he thinks is the truth. A man who's relying simply on best two out of three, he's not interested in the truth. He's interested in a practical way to decide the law, to do so quickly.
So like you said, obviously, and maybe at the end we'll discuss a little bit, minhag, custom comes into all three, but for the Maharshal then, based on how you're explaining it, will always come out more novel, I guess, psak, as opposed to Rav Yosef Karo. So even though he does, like you said, take in custom, he does use some sort of majority rule at times, he does use all these different methods of psak, but generally he's going to be, because of the way he does it, right, it's going to be more mechadish, more novel.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things that appears in Yom Shel Shlomo. Anyone who's going to do this reworking of everything, there's much more room for creativity because you can develop your own thinking. And I think the Maharshal does that. The Maharshal is a very creative thinker. And in psak halacha, he's also willing to step out and say, come to new conclusions. Now, sometimes he gets burned by that. There was a case here, just take a simple example. He believed that if you finished learning a Masechet of Gemara, and you made a siyum, and maybe you could say a certain nusach of Birkat HaMazon, and he thought, well, okay, let's go ahead and do that. And then he backtracked after he did it once because there was a whole dispute that broke out in the place, and he figured, okay, maybe this wasn't such a good idea. But he's willing to take those chances. He's willing to I won't say step on a limb, because he doesn't feel he's going out on a limb. He feels that's the correct reading of the source. In Karo, you don't see that as much because he's bound by other rules. In other words, he seems to be more of a rule-based decider, whereas Luria is one based on his reading what he thinks is the correct way of reading.
There's also an aspect of, there's also an aspect of the Maharshal's, I guess, personality, because just you see it from the seforim, so we would say it's his personality. He's quite harsh. He points out, as you call it in the book, points out blunders of others. He's all the time. I don't know, how does that factor into something that you discuss as well? And anyone who knows Shal Shuvas Maharshal or Amshel Shlomo, this is famous with the Maharshal.
Yeah, he didn't pull punches. He told you exactly what he thought. And, now it's, of course, anyone who's read, for example, any of them, sometimes the Ramban says about Rashi on Chumash, what is he talking about? The Maharshal does it much more than others. The Rema does it sometimes in his tshuva as well. He said, I didn't write the reason for this because I thought any idiot would have known this, but I guess they didn't, so now I'll have to write it. So that appears too, but the Maharshal does it more than others, and he takes no prisoners.
Right. Now, we should also mention, I think something here that we didn't mention, we should mention, the Amshel Shlomo is a fundamentally different book in structure than the other ones. So the Yosef is a commentary on Torah. Shulchan Aruch is, as everyone knows, in small form, psak, halacha, and Rema is his main sefer we'll be talking about is the comments on it. So Yom Shlomo is not like that. So explain the style of Yom Shlomo, how it was written, the kind of book it is.
So Yom Shlomo assumes that if you want to know the final ruling, the practical ruling, you have to go back to the Gemara. So while the Tur and the Rambam are topically organized, the Yom Shlomo is organized according to sugyas. In other words, you follow the Gemara. So if you're going to learn Masechet Yevamot, then you'll learn Yevamot and you'll work your way through all the various sections of Yevamot and come to the practical halachas that evolve from there. That doesn't mean that every once in a while you won't find something that is a little bit of a tangent. But on the whole, you have to study the Gemara first in order to understand Yom Shlomo, because that's his assumption, that you know the Gemara. Whereas in the Torah and the Beit Yosef, which of course is working off the Torah, it's topical. And that's a much different approach. And of course, the Yom Shlomo is harking back to Rosh, for example, right? The Rosh, who the Maharshal has a very high opinion of. He too is organized based upon the order of the Gemara. The Mordechai also. The Rosh and the Mordechai were fundamental sources for learning in Ashkenazic yeshivas, even in the 16th century. They're all Gemara based.
Now, the Amshel Shlomo I mentioned before about the printing history. So first of all, we don't have all the volumes. This probably has to do with that. We don't have them all today. Just editions-wise, I'll mention right here that the newest full edition is the Hamor edition, but Mechon Mishra Sabar and BMG published a few Masechtas already. They're doing, I think it's a little nicer. I don't want to say for sure, but they're also doing it as well. So they did already, I think Baba Kama, Gittin, I don't know offhand, maybe Chulin, I'm not sure offhand which one they did in number. So that's really the kind of Yom Shlomo today. But you mentioned the printing history, and it wasn't printed for a while. It was in manuscript for many years. What happened there? What's the history, and why was it not printed?
So the Yom Shlomo was an incremental work, and he first started working on Bava Kama. He started that in the 1540s. And it seems that when he got to the end of Bava Kama, he was willing or wanted to publish what he had already finished. But that timing wasn't just wasn't there. And he wanted to publish it around 1550, it seems, 1551. But there wasn't Hebrew printing to speak of in Poland at that time. There was some work being done in Lublin, but you couldn't give a work like the Yom Shlomo to a printing house that was in Lublin. It was just getting started. And the best place to publish, as Yosef Karo himself knew, was in Venice. That's where all the important work was being done. Moreover, the Yom Shlomo, Rav Shlomo Luria, had a relative involved in the printing business in Venice, Mayor Katzenellenbogen, the Maharam Padua. So it would seem that he would have wanted to send it off to Venice. The only problem was in the early 1550s, the Maharam Padua got involved in a whole dispute regarding the Mishnah Torah. That didn't help him in the printing business, and very soon thereafter, the Talmud was banned in Italy. So it wouldn't have been a very, very good idea to publish a book that was Talmud-based in Italy in the early 1550s. And then at some point, he saw the Beit Yosef, and that, of course, also had a delay. So the book was never published in his lifetime. And it was only began to be published, Bava Kama began to be published in Prague in the early 17th century, and it took into the 18th century to publish those sections that we have. And so he had bad luck in the printing business. That's what a kol talui b'mazel means, right?
Absolutely. And something else, maybe because of this, the way the Sefer was written, that you point out is that there are multiple introductions to the Sefer. Some seforim, don't have any introduction, but there are seforim that have an introduction by the author. The Yom Shlomo has a multiple introductions. So what did they talk about? And is that why it came about? Because he was just writing the Sefer like piecemeal? Like, is that not in one, sitting?
So essentially, yes. There are only really two introductions to the Yom Shlomo. The Yom Shlomo, the introduction to Bava Kama is the first one, and the one to Chulin is the second one. The ones that appear in Yevamot, Gittin, and Kiddushin, those were made up by publishers in the 18th century. They cut and paste and put in their own little bits and pieces. But the two real introductions are the ones that Luria himself wrote. But one was written in the pre-Beit Yosef world, and one was written in the post-Beit Yosef Shulchan Aruch world. And that's really the difference between them. It seems that he wrote an introduction that was he wanted to publish Bava Kama. Well, that reflected a world before Beit Yosef. When he gets to Chulin, which he writes at the very end of his life, that's a different world. And that calls for a different introduction. So that's why I believe we have these two introductions to Yom Shlomo, representing different points of his creative career.
Okay, so now obviously there's much more here, and you even mentioned the printing history and the Maharam Padua. You discussed that at length in the book. There's a lot in the book. There's also many examples on these two that we didn't really mention. Many examples. There's many examples in the book. The book is replete with examples. I will mention that as well. So then we get on to the Rema, who, by the way, I don't know if we mentioned the Maharshal and the Rema are related, right? So they are.
Right, but if you told me they're basically second cousins, but someone will correct me and say they're second cousins once removed. I'm not very good on the once removed. In the book, I did write down exactly what the relationship was, but if you ask me they're related. They're cousins, and they know they're cousins.
Yes, exactly. They knew they were cousins and they were related. So then we get to Moshe Isserles, the Rema, and his style of psak, and especially, as you call it, Moshe Isserles' responses, so his response to Shulchan Aruch.
So Rav Moshe Isserles, I believe, is not enthralled with Shulchan Aruch. And if you would have asked him to write his own book would probably reflect what he wrote in Torah Chatat, which is a reflection of the laws of Kashrut that he himself wrote, and is a much different character than Shulchan Aruch. But Rav Moshe Isserles realized the power of print, and if he didn't respond to Shulchan Aruch, then Shulchan Aruch would take over. And I believe that his essentially is after the fact. He said, what am I going to do? It's out there. I have to respond. And that's, I think, what guides his response. And his comments, I don't think this is what he really would have envisioned as a halachic sefer for the Ashkenazi community. But Shulchan Aruch was there, and he felt he had to.
Right. So, I mean, you mentioned Teres Achatas, which are, again, editions. There's a number of editions today. There's the Mosar of Cook one, which I think is a nice edition, but it doesn't have, that's just like a contemporary commentary. The old commentaries, you have, I think, Mishar, I think there might be Zichron Aaron. There's a couple of different ones with the commentaries in Teres Achatas, again, on Kashrus. But for the Ramah, like you mentioned, we have Darkei Moshe, and we have Darkei Moshe Aruch, and we have, like you said, his comments on Shulchan Aruch. So, what exactly is his style, so to speak, especially as opposed to the Maharshal and Rav Yosef Karo?
So I think that the Rema is very concerned with a number of factors. He's certainly concerned with Hilchat HaKabatrai. He followed the most recent poskim. Now, for him to follow the most recent poskim means that he's going to be looking to people who lived in the 15th century in particular and follow them, particularly those people who lived somehow in the greater Ashkenazic circle, people like Rav Isserles, people like Rav Yaakov Molin, the Maharshal, people like Maharshal Weil, Rav Jacob Weil. These people are going to be very important to him. They're not really taken into serious consideration within Rav Yosef Karo's work. And so these are people that he wants to have included. Moreover, there's a whole tradition, Ashkenazi tradition, that has developed on many, many topics. If we'll talk about Kashrut, since we mentioned his Torah Chatat, there were the Shari Dura, which was a 13th century work summarizing the laws of Kashrut, was the work that was studied in Ashkenazic circles, and Rav Isserles commented on it, and many other people commented that this was the book that was studied. This is a work that's not really taken into account within the Beit Yosef. So Rav Moshe Isserles wants to bring these works to bear on practice. He wants them to really guide practice. So that's very important. So Hilchat HaKabatrai is important. But he too was not in favor of Yosef Karo's majority rule. He doesn't like that either. So he wants to follow traditions that he knows. He wants to follow these poskim that he knows, and he wants to follow what he thinks are his own thought every once in a while too. He's not anxious to follow these rules, and so that very much characterizes his own work. The only thing is, Rav Moshe Isserles is also very interested in making sure that we don't make mistakes. And in order to not make mistakes, he often will be machmir, because he has a doubt or there are other views. He doesn't know or doesn't want to decide between them. So therefore, when there's not a lot at stake, he wants to be machmir. That being said, if there is a case where there's a large financial loss involved, or it's for kavod Shabbat or things like that, then he's willing to be mekel and rely on earlier opinions that were mekel.
So is he more machmer then because of this, the way his style of psak than the Maharshal and Rav Yosef Karo?
Well, I think that in Rav Yosef Karo, I don't know how, I didn't do a statistical analysis to see how often he's machmer, but yes, I think that you'll find more chumras, particularly in kashrus, in Rav Moshe Isserles' work. Whereas the Maharshal, again, it's hard to say that he's more machmir. Sometimes he is, sometimes he isn't. Depends how he understood the sugya. But he's not interested in being machmir per se. He's interested in being right. And if you're right, then whether it's machmir or mekel, he wants to do what he thinks is right. He's looking for his truth.
But again, the Rema is not focused on using, reasoning and redoing everything like the Maharshal.
No, he's not. He's not. But he wants to be following this Ashkenazic tradition that he sees within these classical works, and he'll follow them. He'll follow them. He'll bring them to bear on his discussion.
Now, when you say traditions, do you mean kind of accepted traditions that they had, or things like Sefer Maril, minhag, Tirna, seforim? That there's a lot of these minhag seforim. People that aren't familiar can see Machon Yerushalayim has redone a lot of them. They're around in beautiful editions. Is that what you're talking about?
So the Rema is very interested in those sort of books, but he's also, if there are well-accepted traditions, and this is true of the Maharshal as well, if he has something that he has a Kabbalah does not in the sense of mysticism, but a Kabbalah in the sense of I have a tradition. If the Maharshal has a tradition, even he is not going to rule against a received tradition. And that's true of the Rema as well. If they have received traditions that they know have been accepted by important people, not necessarily great poskim, but important people, they're going to follow those. They're not going to rule against those unless there's some sort of extenuating circumstances.
Yeah, this always seems the factor. I mean, I don't know if you know this in Ashkenaz versus Sfard psak. Is that because a lot of these minhag seforim and minhag seem to play a greater role in Ashkenaz and Germany, in the Ashkenazic world? I don't know if that's factually accurate.
Well, I think it's true. I think that's true. The minhagim books do, and there's a scholar named Luria, who's written about why these minhagim books are so important, and part of it has to do with the displacement of German Jewry in the 15th century. They've moved on to Italy or to other places. They're trying somehow to maintain these customs in new settings, and minhag becomes very important. You can go back even further after the Black Death, right? German Jewry was decimated. They're trying to recreate what was. We've got to get that back somehow. So it becomes very important.
Yeah, so this is, like you said, when we're talking about the Rema, this is like you mentioned in the book, and this is what is customarily done, hachinog, as you mentioned, that he does very often. Right.
So he has a different, well, what I argue in the book is, and I hope that people will consider this and either correct me if I'm wrong or accept if it's correct, but Bahachi Nahug, I don't think means that this is our custom. I think Bahachi Nahug, in the language of the Rema, as in some other poskim, as I try to point out, means that that's what we should do. Whereas if they want to say that this is the custom, they'll say V'chein nohagim. So there's a different, the phrase I think is an important phrase, and it has been understood to be this is the custom, but I'm not sure that's true. And even one of Rama's contemporaries, Rav Chaim ben Betzalel, was aware of this and accused the Rama of being somewhat tricky here, because he said people are going to understand when you say Bahachi Nahug, that's the custom, and that's not what you mean. But that will help you win the day. So that's that turn of phrase is a phrase that even one of the students asked him about.
Right, Reb Chaim ben Betzalel, Reb Chaim Friedberg, right? That was the Maharal's brother.
The Maharal's brother, and someone who studied together with Rama in their early days in the yeshiva of Shalom Shachner.
Right,
so they knew each other.
Yeah, we didn't even really mention Shalom Shachner, Yaakov Palak, all of the luminaries of Poland of that time, the unknown today to a lot of people.
Right, well, they didn't write too much. And they did that consciously. They didn't want people to rely on their writings. But they really were the people who set Polish Jewry upon its way.
Yeah, so with the Rama, there are some other things in the book that you discuss where he does have other, styles where he has legal rationales, consensus, majority rule. I don't know if you want to talk about where the Rama does have, besides, other mahalchim of psak, other ways of paskening as well.
He has a number of different ways. He's not a one-trick rabbi. But he has a number of ways. And consensus, of course, is a difficult idea. But if he believes that there is a broad consensus among Ashkenazic poskim, he will follow it. He rarely goes against what he thinks is generally done.
Now, there's also the printing history of the Rama and his glosses on Shulchan Aruch, as you discuss in the book, and how that came about. You discuss that process, which is very interesting. Brett, you wanted to mention that and discuss that for the listeners that aren't familiar, and how the process went of the printing of Shulchan Aruch to getting the Rama into the Shulchan Aruch.
So when the Rama originally, I don't know how he wrote his notes, we don't have the manuscript, but when it was first printed, actually it was sort of a red herring. The halachas of Nida were published first as part of Torat Chatat in 1569, a small section of Shulchan Aruch, perhaps just a test to see, was this book going to be accepted? But if we look at that first edition, we see that the notes of the Rama are really off to the side. They're not part of the text. They're what I guess we would call today side notes. They're not footnotes at the bottom of the page, but if you sort of look at the page, you'll see they're along the side. But they're not part of Karo's text. It's the printer, Shmuel Baum, who would later move Isserles' notes into the run of text of Karo. And of course, that was a crucial stage in their acceptance because it moved them from being comments on Karo's text to be part of Karo's text. And that technical aspect, even a visual aspect, was, I believe, very, very important to have Rema go together with Rav Yosef Karo, become an integral part of the book, and not just another commentary around the side. So that was something that Isserles himself did not do. He had already died. But this is something the publisher did posthumously and put it right into the text. Granted in parentheses or in some other form, but it becomes part of the run of text, essentially.
Yeah, you have pictures of that in the book. And I will mention this is a book, like the discussion is about, and this is a book about halacha and the development of halacha. But there is a lot of book history, and for those interested like me, there's a lot of very interesting book history about these seforim and these mechaberim, and so and also like Maram Padua. There's a lot of very interesting other stuff. Now, something in here that's a really fascinating thing. There's obviously much more on all these, and the Rema and the Maharshal and everything. But something that's really interesting is, as you call, getting personal. There's a personal kind of halachic dispute that gets personal between the Rema and the Maharshal. Maybe you want to stay with the story because it's really fascinating.
So, despite their being cousins, and despite their being, it seems, on good terms earlier in their lives, towards the end of the Rama's life, students brought reports about something that the Maharshal had said in a certain ruling. And Isserles claimed, okay, he followed what he had heard. And this got back to the Maharshal, who exploded and wrote a, harsh letter back to the Rema about this. And this basically caused a rift in their relationship. And the Rema denied that he had ever said this. And the only problem is that in one of the copies of the Shari Dura that exists in the National Library, there's a note written during the Rama's lifetime that seems to suggest that the Rama indeed had said this. So the Rama tried to placate the Maharshal. I don't know how successful he was, but the end of their lives, they were not happy cousins.
Yeah, so Shari Dura we have printed today with Maharshal's notes. We have the Maharshal's notes commentary on Shari Dura. That's something as well. Okay, so that's one story. I mean, in general, just want to ask just a general question. How does minhag play into the thought of all three? I know we mentioned it throughout, but minhag is something. So in all three of them, it sounds like in the Ashkenazi ones, it plays more of a role as opposed to Rav Yosef Karo.
So Rav Yosef Karo is also very respectful of minhag, but it depends on the nature of the minhag. He had been in a lot of places, so he had seen different customs, and of course, living in Sfat, there were people who came from different places to these communities, so he was aware of the different possibilities of minhagim. So he is respectful of minhag. However, the Maharshal and the Rema, minhag does have a more, what I would call a special place, particularly for the Rema. Minhag has an important place. But again, particularly those minhagim that they believe are valid minhagim, that these, sometimes they call them vatikin, not the sense of people who get up early to daven, but rather that these are old minhagim that have been attested to. And these have special status because they look back on the rabbis who did this as being special people. So they're not quick to dismiss these sort of customs. So that's why minhag has a special place here for these people.
Okay, there's a lot more, many examples that we didn't really discuss. There's a lot on kashrus in here, so if you don't know a lot about kashrus, I'm not a bucky in kashrus by any stretch of the imagination, and I really learned a lot. It's very interesting to see a lot of the back and forth and the comments on kashrus. There's a lot in the book, so it's very interesting there. So just as a final kind of question here, I know I mentioned this in the beginning, but what is the book aiming to do? What were you trying to accomplish with the book? Just to show the different styles of psak, the development, how halacha developed, accepted halachic seforim?
Yes, in part, but also I would like readers to realize that when they use Shulchan Aruch, they should realize that Shulchan Aruch really is, it's not just a flat book. That is to say that this is a complicated. If you're going to decide to follow Shulchan Aruch, then you're following a certain method. And if you're going to decide to follow the Rema, you're following a different method. And if you don't like either of those methods and you want to follow the Maharshal, that's a different method. But one shouldn't think just because Shulchan Aruch is printed and it all looks, as I said, flat, that doesn't mean there aren't ridges there and it's not textured. These books represent different positions on how to arrive at the final ruling in halakha. And I believe that end users should be aware of that.
Yes, and it's definitely a fascinating book. It made for some really interesting Shavuos reading material that I quite enjoyed it. So one final question, what are your future projects? The last time I had you on the podcast, you mentioned this book. Are you working on something now?
So I'm working now I'm going through the tshuvas of the Rema rather carefully. And one of the issues that takes place with the publication of Beit Yosef is it opens up a much broader library to poskim. The Ashkenazic library was rather limited. With the Beit Yosef, they get exposure to a much broader world. How do they integrate that? How do they use it? Are they accepting, not accepting? So that's what I'm reading through to see how the Ashkenazic world was opened up. Or maybe it wasn't. But it will certainly be opened up by the time we get to the Shach. The Shach uses everybody. But we'll see. I'm trying to figure out whether the Rema was as open as his successors would be.
Okay, sounds interesting. So I'll post the link in the show's notes to purchase the book. I will warn the listeners it's a bit pricey. We'll see if there's any promo codes or anything, any sales. I don't know what's with that, but it is a fascinating read, a really interesting book, and I very much enjoyed it. And I want to thank you, Professor Fram, for joining me once again to talk about this book.
Thank you very much for having me. Thank you.